I've built my entire career on one rule. If you follow the law, you sleep at night. That belief cost me my job, my reputation, and almost my family. It started on an ordinary Tuesday, with a routine budget review and a cup of burnt office coffee. Then I saw my younger brother's name where it didn't belong. He smiled at dinner like nothing was wrong, except he kept his phone face down. I thought I was uncovering corruption. I didn't realize I was the one being measured. I used to believe that if you followed the rules long enough, the rules would eventually protect you. That belief shaped everything about my life. It shaped how I worked, how I raised my voice in meetings, how I judged people who cut corners and called it being practical. I was 48 years old, living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I had built a reputation on being the guy who never needed favors. No backroom calls, no quiet understandings, just procedures, signatures, and clean spreadsheets. Every weekday morning started the same way. I parked my silver Ford Explorer in the same corner spot of the county building's garage, third level, near the column with the faded yellow paint. I liked that spot because it forced me to walk past the security desk, nod at the same guard, and badge in like everyone else. No shortcuts. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, 2 at a time, coffee thermos in my left hand, keys in my right. My office smelled like paper, dust, and burnt coffee from the communal pot down the hall. Nothing fancy. Gray carpet, beige walls, a single window that looked out over a parking lot, and the edge of Lake Michigan on clear days. I managed infrastructure projects for the city bridges, drainage systems, road repairs that never made the news unless something went wrong. My job was to make sure public money went exactly where it was supposed to go. I was proud of that. Quietly proud, but proud. When people complained that government work was slow, I took it personally. Slow meant careful. Careful meant honest. Honest meant I could go home at night, sit on my porch, and sleep without replaying conversations in my head. Home was a narrow 2-story house on the south side, brick with white trim, built sometime in the 1950s. Nothing special, but solid. The kind of house that had survived decades of Wisconsin winters because it was built by people who expected things to last. I'd bought it after my divorce, when my life downsized and simplified itself without asking my permission. Most evenings, I cooked for one. Pasta, chicken, something frozen if I was tired. Tuesdays were different. Tuesdays were family. My younger brother Lucas came over every Tuesday night for dinner. He was 5 years younger than me, which meant that for most of our childhood, I had been the responsible one by default. The one who remembered homework, the one who showed up early, the one teachers praised and adults trusted. Lucas had always lived in my shadow, or at least that's how I saw it. He drifted after high school, tried community college, dropped out, bounced between jobs that never stuck. Warehouse work, delivery driving, short stints at places that closed or let him go, for reasons he never fully explained. By the time he was 43, Lucas had no steady job, no savings, and a talent for making bad situations sound like they were someone else's fault. I didn't hate him for it, but I didn't respect him either. Not the way I respected effort, not the way I respected accountability. On Tuesdays, he showed up around 6:30, usually late by 10 minutes, usually apologizing with the same half smile. He wore the same black hoodie most weeks, the cuffs frayed, the zipper broken. He ate whatever I put in front of him and complimented it like I'd just served him something special. "How's work?" I'd ask, out of habit more than interest. "Same stuff," he'd say. "I'm figuring some things out." That phrase, figuring some things out, had become his shield. It meant nothing and everything at the same time. After dinner, we'd sit at the small kitchen table, the one with the wobbling leg I kept meaning to fix. Lucas talked about people I didn't know, plans that never solidified, ideas that sounded better the less detail he provided. I listened, nodded, offered advice he rarely followed. It was the rhythm we'd settled into. In my head, the roles were clear. I was the stable one. He was the cautionary tale. I never said that out loud, but I thought it often. At work, things were steady. I was overseeing a mid-sized road reconstruction project. Nothing glamorous, but expensive enough to attract attention. multiple subcontractors, layers of approvals, weekly reports that cross my desk every Friday afternoon. That Tuesday, the one I remember clearly now, started like any other. Gray sky, cold wind coming off the lake. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the office pot and grimaced at the taste. Burnt, like always. I sat down, opened my laptop, and pulled up the budget review file. Numbers lined up the way they were supposed to. Labor costs, materials, equipment rentals. I scanned without really seeing, trusting patterns I'd memorized over years of repetition. Then, something caught my eye. It wasn't a big number. It wasn't red flag obvious. It was a name, a small consulting fee, buried 3 layers deep under a subcontractor I barely paid attention to. A name I recognized not because it belonged in the file, but because it didn't belong anywhere near my work. Lucas Walker. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, convinced my brain had misfired. It happens sometimes, the way you think you hear someone call your name in a crowded room. I scrolled back up, then down again, slower this time. There it was, same spelling, same middle initial, same address I'd mailed Christmas cards to for years. My first instinct wasn't anger, it was dismissal. Coincidence, common name, could be anyone. But Lucas didn't have a common name, and he didn't have a consulting business. He didn't even have a checking account that wasn't perpetually overdrawn. I leaned back in my chair, the old springs creaking under my weight. Around me, the office hummed with printers and muted phone conversations. No alarms, no dramatic music. Just a quiet moment where something that had always felt solid shifted, almost imperceptibly. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. That was my rule. Facts first, assumptions last. I opened another tab and searched the vendor database. The name came up again, attached to 2 small payments over the past month. Legal, approved, properly documented. My stomach tightened, just a little. At 6:30 that evening, Lucas knocked on my front door like he always did. Same hoodie, same half smile. He stepped inside, rubbed his hands together to warm them, and said, "Smells good," like nothing in the world had changed. We ate. We talked about nothing. He laughed at a joke I barely remember telling. At one point, he set his phone down on the table, screen facing the wood instead of the ceiling. I noticed it, registered it, and didn't say a word. At the time, it felt like nothing. Later, I would understand it was the first crack in everything I thought I knew. I told myself to sleep on it. That was always my move when something didn't sit right. Sleep first, review later. Decisions made at night had a way of growing claws by morning. So I washed the dishes, locked the door, and went upstairs like it was any other Tuesday. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the furnace click on and off, the old pipes knocking the way they always did when the temperature dropped. My mind kept circling back to the same image. My brother's name sitting inside a government budget file, calm and unbothered, like it had every right to be there. By 5:30, I gave up. I got dressed, made coffee at home strong this time, and stood at the kitchen counter staring at the steam rise from the mug. The house felt smaller than it had the night before, like it had shifted a few inches inward while I wasn't looking. At work, I didn't mention anything to anyone. That was rule number 1. Don't spread uncertainty. I closed my office door, reopened the file, and started over from the top, forcing myself to read every line instead of skimming. The payments were small, almost insulting in how careful they were. Just enough to exist, not enough to draw attention. The subcontractor was legitimate, licensed, and had been working with the city for years. Everything checked out. Everything except the fact that my brother's name shouldn't have been anywhere near it. I pulled up the public vendor registry. No Lucas Walker consulting firm. No LLC. No DBA. Nothing. I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe someone had fat-fingered the wrong name. Then I checked the tax ID attached to the payment. It wasn't a mistake. It matched Lucas's social security number. That was the moment my body reacted before my mind did. A tightening in my chest. A pressure behind my eyes. The kind of physical response that told you this wasn't hypothetical anymore. I leaned back, hands flat on my desk, and stared at the ceiling tiles. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed. A printer jammed. Life went on without acknowledging that my understanding of my own family had just taken a hit. I should have called him. That would have been the normal thing to do. Pick up the phone, ask a question, give him a chance to explain. Instead, I did what I had trained myself to do for years. I treated it like a case. I created a new folder on my desktop and named it Review. Neutral, non-accusatory. Inside, I saved copies of the payment records, the vendor contracts, the approval signatures. I told myself I was being responsible, not suspicious. But suspicion was already there. It had slipped in quietly and made itself comfortable. Over the next few days, I watched Lucas differently. He didn't know that, of course. From his perspective, nothing had changed. He still texted on Mondays to confirm dinner. He still showed up late. He still complained about the price of gas and the unfairness of the job market. But I started paying attention to details I'd ignored before. The way he never mentioned specific employers anymore. The way he talked about money with a casualness that didn't match his supposed situation. The new boots he wore one night, clean and expensive looking, which he brushed off as a gift from a friend. I didn't confront him. I didn't even hint. Instead, I broke another rule. I looked him up, not on social media, that would have been too obvious. I used internal databases I had legitimate access to, under the justification of due diligence. Public records, business filings, property transactions. Nothing jumped out. No sudden wealth, no flashy purchases. If Lucas was doing something wrong, he was doing it carefully. That should have reassured me. It didn't. The following Friday, an email landed in my inbox just before lunch. No subject line, no sender name, just a string of letters that didn't match any address I recognized. The message itself was short. If you believe in clean hands, watch where your brother goes on Thursday nights. That was it. No signature, no threat, no explanation. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. My first thought was that it was spam, some automated nonsense that happened to hit a nerve by coincidence. But the timing was too precise. The wording too deliberate. Thursday nights. Lucas never came over on Thursdays. I had no idea what he did those nights. I deleted the email. Then I checked the trash folder and restored it. I told myself I wasn't taking it seriously. I was just being cautious. But something in me had shifted. The email hadn't introduced doubt. It had named it. That Thursday, I left work at 5, like usual. I drove home, changed clothes, and sat in my car in the driveway longer than necessary, hands on the steering wheel, engine off. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do. I justified it anyway. I waited until 6:30, then drove toward Lucas's apartment complex, a low-rise building near an old industrial area, paint peeling, parking lot patched more times than it had been fully repaved. I parked across the street, far enough away that my car wouldn't stand out. At 6:45, Lucas came out. He wasn't wearing the hoodie. He had on a jacket I hadn't seen before, dark and fitted. He checked his phone, glanced around the lot, then got into his car and drove off. I followed at a distance. I told myself it was temporary, just to see where he went, just to satisfy my own mind so I could put this behind me. We drove west, away from downtown, past neighborhoods that had seen better decades, closed factories, bars with neon signs that buzzed even in daylight. He parked near a community center I recognized from old city maps, the kind of place that hosted job fairs and public meetings no one attended unless they had to. I stayed in the car and watched. People started arriving in small groups, not dressed alike, not acting suspicious, just ordinary. A woman with a grocery bag, an older man using a cane, a guy in a reflective vest like he'd come straight from a job site. Lucas went inside. I waited 20 minutes, 30. No drugs, no cash exchanges, no shady handoffs, just people walking in and out of a building I'd approved maintenance funding for 3 years earlier. I drove home feeling foolish and unsettled at the same time. That night, lying in bed again, I realized something that bothered me more than the email, more than the money, more than the secrecy. I hadn't once considered that Lucas might be doing something good. The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. I had jumped straight to wrongdoing because it fit the version of him I'd carried for years. The irresponsible one. The screw-up. The brother I measured myself against to feel better about my own choices. That realization sat heavy in my chest. I told myself I'd stop, that I'd let it go, that the next step would be a conversation, like a normal person. The next morning, I opened the folder on my desktop and added another file. By Monday morning, the folder on my desktop felt heavier than it had any right to. It was just data, PDFs, spreadsheets, screenshots, but every time I clicked it open, I felt like I was stepping across a line I hadn't planned to cross. I told myself it was still professional curiosity, still caution, still within bounds. But the truth was simpler and less flattering. I didn't like not knowing. At work, I kept my routine tight. Meetings, site reports, approvals. I spoke when spoken to, nodded through discussions that usually engaged me more. A few colleagues asked if I was feeling all right. I said I was fine. I always said I was fine. The email sat in the back of my mind like a splinter. Watch where your brother goes on Thursday nights. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even advice. It was a dare. I tried to focus on the rational explanations. Someone had a grudge against Lucas. Someone wanted to mess with me because of my position. Someone thought it would be funny to make a government employee sweat. But the email hadn't asked me to do anything illegal. It hadn't threatened exposure. It hadn't even accused Lucas of anything directly. It had simply appealed to something I'd spent my entire career cultivating. The belief that I was the kind of person who noticed when things were off. That belief mattered to me more than I wanted to admit. On Tuesday night, Lucas came over for dinner like nothing was wrong. He brought a loaf of bread from a bakery down the street and apologized for being late, which was new. We ate in relative silence, the kind that settles in when both people are thinking but neither wants to steer the conversation. At one point, I almost asked him outright. I could feel the question rise, pressing against the back of my teeth. Why is your name in my files? It would have been clean, direct, honest. Instead, I asked him if he was seeing anyone. He laughed, shook his head, and said, "Not my season." I nodded, pretended that was enough. When he left, I stood at the window and watched him walk to his car. He checked his mirrors before pulling out, a small, habitual movement that meant nothing on its own. I watched anyway. Thursday came faster than I expected. All day, I told myself I wouldn't do it, that I'd go home, cook dinner, watch something mindless, and forget the whole thing. I even left work on time, deliberately avoiding the excuses I usually gave myself to stay late. At 6 o'clock, I was sitting on my couch with a plate of food balanced on my knees when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You don't have to believe me. Just look." That was it. No follow-up. No explanation. I set the phone down and stared at the dark TV screen, my own reflection faintly visible. I looked tired, older than I remembered feeling. I stood up, put the plate in the sink, and grabbed my keys. Lucas's Thursday routine was easier to trace this time. I didn't have to park across the street and wait. I already knew roughly when he left and which direction he drove. I followed from a greater distance, keeping 2 or 3 cars between us, blending into traffic. This time, he didn't go to the community center. He drove north, toward a quieter part of the city, where residential streets gave way to small office buildings and converted warehouses. He parked behind a low brick structure with a faded sign that read, "Midwest Resource Cooperative." The windows were dark, but there were lights on inside. I parked farther down the street and waited. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel clever. I felt tense, like someone waiting for a doctor to walk back into the room with test results. People arrived in 1s and 2s, some on foot, some by car. A woman in a winter coat too thin for the weather. A man with a lunch pail, still wearing work boots. They nodded to each other, exchanged a few words, and went inside. Lucas stood near the door for a moment, talking to an older man with gray hair and a stiff posture. They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. They spoke quietly. Then Lucas held the door as the man went in. I checked the time. 7:15. I waited. At 7:30, I noticed something odd, not alarming, just out of place. A city vehicle pulled up across the street, unmarked, but I recognized the fleet plate. Someone got out, adjusted their jacket, and walked toward the building without looking around. My chest tightened. I knew that walk. I'd done it myself more times than I could count. Purposeful, neutral, trained not to draw attention. What was a city employee doing here? I leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was professional concern. At 8 o'clock, people began to leave. No rush, no tension. They looked tired, not guilty. Like they'd just finished something that required attention, not secrecy. Lucas came out last. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, scrolling through his phone, then slipped it into his pocket and walked to his car. He didn't look around this time. He didn't need to. I drove home with my headlights off until I reached the main road. That night, I opened my laptop and searched for the Midwest Resource Cooperative. The website was bare bones, mission statements, vague language about community oversight and public accountability. No staff list, no donors, no press. I dug deeper. Buried in a PDF linked at the bottom of the site was a name I recognized immediately. A former city auditor, one who had resigned quietly 2 years earlier after raising concerns that went nowhere. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wisconsin winter. The next morning, I didn't go into the office right away. I stopped at a coffee shop near the lake, sat by the window, and watched the water churn under a low gray sky. I needed space to think, and my office wasn't safe for that anymore. If Lucas was involved with something like this, something that looked at government work from the outside, then the consulting payments took on a different shape. Still questionable, still uncomfortable, but not immediately criminal, unless they were. The problem was, I didn't know where the line was anymore. That afternoon, my supervisor stopped by my office. Casual, friendly, asked how things were going on the road project. I answered smoothly, gave the expected updates, kept my voice even. As he left, he paused and said, "You know, if you ever see something that doesn't sit right, my door's always open." He smiled like it was nothing. I smiled back. The folder on my desktop was no longer neutral. It was a decision waiting to be made. That evening, Lucas didn't text to confirm dinner for the following week. I didn't text him either. Instead, I opened my laptop at home and started drafting a memo. Not to send, just to organize my thoughts, just to see how it would look in words. Halfway through, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Most people fail this part without realizing it. I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to fear. Not of Lucas, of myself. By the time I finished reading the message, my coffee had gone cold. Most people fail this part without realizing it. I read it again, slower, looking for something I'd missed the first time. There was nothing else. No punctuation, flourish. No signature, just a statement, calm and almost instructional, like something written on a whiteboard during a training session. I set the phone down and rubbed my eyes. I told myself this was getting out of hand, that I was letting anonymous messages steer my thinking, that whatever Lucas was doing, it wasn't my responsibility to police my own brother. And yet, the next morning, when I left for work, I took a different route than usual. I didn't go straight to the county building. I drove past Lucas's apartment instead, slowing just enough to see whether his car was still there. It was. I noted the time without writing it down. Old habits from work. Observe first, record later. At the office, I did the bare minimum. I answered emails, signed off on routine approvals. I didn't open the budget file again, but I didn't close it either. It stayed minimized on my screen like a thought I wasn't ready to finish. Around noon, I checked my phone and saw a missed call from Lucas. No voicemail. That was unusual. He didn't call unless something was wrong or he needed help. I stared at the notification longer than necessary, then locked my phone and slid it face down onto my desk. That small action mirroring his didn't escape me. That afternoon, I left early under the excuse of a site visit. It wasn't a lie. I did drive by one of the project locations. I just didn't stay long. I spent more time parked a few blocks away, watching traffic patterns that had nothing to do with roadwork. At 4:30, Lucas's car pulled out of his apartment complex. I followed. I kept my distance better this time. I knew the routes now, knew where he tended to slow down, which lights caught him more often. He drove with the ease of someone who wasn't worried about being followed. That should have reassured me. It didn't. He didn't go to the cooperative or the community center. He drove to the north side, into a neighborhood of small duplexes and older storefronts converted into offices. He parked near a laundromat and walked into a building with no sign at all, just a door and a buzzer panel with names scratched off. I parked across the street and waited. This was the part I told myself I wouldn't cross. Sitting in my car, watching a door, trying to read meaning into who went in and who came out. This wasn't due diligence. This was surveillance, and I knew it, but I stayed. A woman came out first, carrying a folder under her arm. She looked tired. A man followed her a few minutes later, older, moving carefully, like his knees bothered him. They nodded to each other but didn't speak. Lucas didn't come out. I checked my watch. 5:15, 5:30, 5:45. I imagined him inside, talking, listening, explaining things I didn't understand. I imagined money changing hands, then imagined no money at all, just information. The problem with imagination is that it fills gaps, whether you ask it to or not. At 6 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A text from Lucas. "You okay? You missed my call." I didn't respond. He came out 10 minutes later, alone. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look relieved. He looked focused, like someone finishing a task rather than escaping one. I followed him home. That night, I couldn't bring myself to cook. I ate crackers and cheese at the kitchen counter, standing up, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The house felt different now, less like a refuge, more like a place where thoughts echoed too loudly. I opened my laptop and started searching again. This time, I didn't limit myself to the cooperative's website. I looked up addresses, cross-referenced names I'd seen on documents with public records, old meeting minutes, archived local news articles that barely anyone had read. A pattern began to emerge. Not corruption, not exactly. Oversight. Groups of citizens, former city employees, contractors who'd been burned by late payments or canceled projects. People who understood the system well enough to see where it bent, even when it didn't break. And Lucas was in the middle of it. Not as a leader, not as a frontman, more like a connector. Someone who knew how to talk to people who didn't trust official channels anymore. That didn't make him innocent. But it didn't make him what I'd assumed, either. The next day at work, I found myself watching my colleagues the way I'd been watching my brother. Not suspiciously, critically. I noticed who approved things quickly, who asked questions, who avoided certain topics in meetings. I didn't like what that did to me. At lunch, I sat alone in my car and ate a sandwich without tasting it. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Observation feels responsible. It isn't. It's just safer than asking. I felt my jaw tighten. They were right. Whoever they were. That afternoon, my supervisor called a short meeting. Routine check-in. We went over timelines, discussed a minor delay, laughed about the weather. As people filed out, he stayed behind and closed the door. "Everything okay with you?" he asked, leaning against a file cabinet. "Yes," I said, too quickly. He studied me for a moment, not unkindly. "You've been quiet." I shrugged. "Just tired," he nodded. "Well, don't carry things alone. That never ends well." I left his office with the strange sensation that I'd just been evaluated without realizing it. That evening, Lucas showed up, unannounced. I heard the knock and froze for a second before answering. He stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, eyes searching my face like he was looking for a crack. "Did I do something?" he asked. "No," I said. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the way he shifted his weight, the way his shoulders tensed slightly. "You've been different. So have you," I said before I could stop myself. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We all change." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was true in a way neither of us wanted to unpack. He stayed for 10 minutes, talked about nothing, left without sitting down. After he was gone, I stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to the quiet settle back into the house. That night, I added a new section to the memo I'd been drafting. I titled it Behavioral Indicators. Seeing the words on the screen made my stomach turn. I had crossed another line. And the worst part was, no one had pushed me. I had walked over it myself. By the following week, I had stopped pretending this was temporary. The memo on my laptop had grown from a page of disjointed thoughts into something that looked uncomfortably official. Headings, bullet points, dates, cross-references. The kind of structure I used at work when something needed to be defensible, not just true. I didn't tell myself I was building a case. I told myself I was organizing information. That distinction mattered to me, even if it was already starting to blur. I began by pulling everything I could legally access: vendor histories, payment timelines, approval chains. I avoided anything that would require me to bypass permissions or leave an audit trail that couldn't be explained later. I was careful, methodical, almost proud of how clean I kept it. Lucas's payments were still there, small, spaced out, always tied to consultation services. The descriptions were vague but not unusual. That was part of the problem. Nothing jumped out as obviously wrong. But patterns don't need to be illegal to be unsettling. The payments coincided with specific project phases, moments when cost overruns were most likely, when decisions were rushed, when oversight thinned out under pressure to meet deadlines. I highlighted those dates and leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. It was circumstantial, but it was consistent. At home, Lucas continued his routines. Tuesdays, texts, late arrivals, casual apologies. If he sensed my attention, he didn't show it. Or maybe he did, and I wasn't good enough at reading him to notice. That thought irritated me more than it should have. On Wednesday afternoon, I received another message from the unknown number. You're looking at money because it's easier than motives. I stared at the words, anger flaring briefly. Whoever this was, they were getting too familiar, too confident. I didn't respond. Instead, I shifted my focus. If Lucas wasn't acting alone, if he was part of something larger, then there would be communication. Emails, messages, digital traces. I didn't have access to his phone or his accounts, and I wasn't about to hack anything. That would cross a line I wasn't ready to justify. But I did have access to public records. I spent a Saturday morning at my dining table with my laptop and a legal pad, the house quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. I searched nonprofit filings, grant applications, community organization rosters, names I'd seen on documents before, now appearing in different contexts. That's when I found it. An email address, not Lucas's personal one. A generic address tied to the Midwest Resource Cooperative, buried in a PDF that listed external consultants. No job titles, no bios, just names and contact information. Lucas Walker was there. I printed the page and laid it flat on the table, smoothing the paper like it might curl up and escape. Seeing his name on something physical made it feel more real, less deniable. I told myself this was what I needed. Confirmation. Something concrete. Except it didn't feel like confirmation. It felt like acceleration. That evening, I drove past the cooperative again. Not to follow Lucas this time, just to see the building in daylight. To ground myself in something tangible. The sign was faded. The windows were clean but bare. No banners. No slogans. No indication of what actually happened inside. A place designed not to draw attention. I sat in my car and watched people come and go. No secrecy. No urgency. Still, I took notes. Arrival times. Number of people. Patterns that probably meant nothing. On the drive home, I realized I was doing something I'd criticized others for at work, letting suspicion guide my analysis instead of facts. I acknowledged the thought. Then I kept going. Sunday night, I received a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. No caller ID. The message was short and clipped, the voice neutral, almost bored. Check your sent folder, the voice said. Not his. Yours. The line went dead. My first reaction was disbelief. My second was anger. My third, reluctantly, was curiosity. I opened my email and navigated to the sent folder. Years of messages scrolled past routine approvals, meeting confirmations, polite deferrals. I sorted by recipient domain, filtering out internal addresses. That's when I saw it. An email I didn't remember sending, dated 6 months earlier, addressed to a city contractor I'd worked with briefly. The subject line was innocuous. Clarification needed. I opened it. The body was short, professional, asking a question about cost adjustments during a bidding phase, something I'd done dozens of times before. But there was a sentence at the bottom that made my breath catch. I trust you'll handle this discreetly, as discussed. I stared at the screen, my mind scrambling to recall the context. Had there been a conversation? A meeting? A hallway exchange I'd forgotten? I searched my calendar. Found nothing. The email wasn't illegal. It wasn't explicit. It didn't promise anything or ask for anything improper. But it implied understanding. I closed the laptop slowly, my hands resting on the table. My reflection stared back at me from the dark screen, unfamiliar and tight around the eyes. I replayed the past year in my head. Meetings, calls, conversations that blurred together. Had I ever said something that could be interpreted as a green light? Had I ever leaned too hard on trust instead of documentation? The thought made my stomach churn. I listened to the voicemail again. The voice hadn't accused me. It hadn't threatened exposure. It had nudged. I spent the rest of the night going through my sent messages, one by one. Not just the obvious ones, the small ones. The replies sent late in the day when I'd been tired. The shorthand phrases I used with people I thought I understood. Nothing leapt out as criminal, but enough of it was flexible. By Monday morning, I was exhausted in a way sleep hadn't touched. At work, I watched my colleagues with new eyes. Not suspicion exactly, awareness. I noticed how often people relied on implied understandings instead of written ones. How often everyone knows replaced clear policy. I wondered how often I'd benefited from that without questioning it. At lunch, I sat alone in my car again, phone in my hand, debating whether to call Lucas. I didn't. That afternoon, I received one last message from the unknown number. You're collecting proof to protect the version of yourself you prefer. I deleted it immediately. Then, without really deciding to, I added a new section to the memo. Potential conflicts of interest. Underneath it, I typed my brother's name. And below that, without intending to, I typed my own. I stared at the screen, my pulse loud in my ears. This was no longer about Lucas doing something wrong. It was about whether I was willing to admit that the line I believed in so strongly wasn't as sharp as I'd told myself. The evidence I had didn't condemn him. It made sense, and that terrified me. Once my name was on the page, I couldn't pretend this was still theoretical. I stared at it for a long time. Ethan Walker typed in the same neutral font I used for vendors and project codes. No emphasis, no explanation. Just a name sitting under a heading that implied risk. I told myself it was responsible to include it, that a proper review demanded completeness, that if I was serious about integrity, I couldn't exempt myself. That was the version of the story I told myself. The truth was harder to sit with. I didn't trust my own objectivity anymore, and instead of stopping, I doubled down. At work, I became quieter, not withdrawn strategic. I listened more than I spoke in meetings, not because I wanted to understand, but because I wanted to measure. Who hesitated? Who jumped in too quickly? Who avoided eye contact when certain topics came up? I started taking notes after conversations, not officially, not in any system tied to my badge or login. Just a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer, the kind contractors used on site. Dates, initials, fragments of phrases. Shouldn't be an issue. We've handled this before. You know how these things go. The words piled up faster than I expected. I told myself I wasn't accusing anyone. I was documenting patterns. But patterns have a way of shaping conclusions before you're ready to admit it. Lucas didn't text that week. Neither did I. The silence between us stretched, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Tuesday came and went without dinner, without the usual rhythm that had defined our relationship for years. I noticed the absence more than I wanted to. On Wednesday afternoon, I ran into him by accident. Or at least, that's what I told myself at the time. I'd stopped by a hardware store near my house after work, wandering the aisles without really needing anything. He was there, standing near the paint counter, talking to an employee about primer types. We froze when we saw each other, that half second of surprise stretching longer than it should have. "Hey," he said first. "Hey," I replied. He looked thinner, or maybe I was imagining it. His jacket was zipped up higher than usual, his hands shoved deep into the pockets like he was bracing himself. "You didn't come by last night," he said, casual on the surface. "I had a lot going on," I said. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too." We stood there, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of paint and lumber filling the air. Ordinary, normal, and somehow heavier than any argument we'd ever had. "You okay?" he asked. I almost laughed. The question felt loaded now, layered with meanings he couldn't possibly know, and I couldn't explain without unraveling everything. "I'm fine," I said. Again, he studied my face for a moment, like he was deciding whether to push. Then he nodded and stepped back. "See you around," he said. "Yeah," I replied. I watched him walk away, the automatic doors hissing open and close behind him, and felt a sharp, unexpected pang of something like guilt. That night, I opened the memo again and read it from the beginning, forcing myself to see it as someone else might. The tone was measured, careful, objective. It also read like something written by a man who had already made up his mind. I didn't like that, so I added another section. Steps taken to avoid bias. The irony wasn't lost on me. I listed things I told myself proved I was being fair, not confronting Lucas directly, not accessing restricted systems, not sharing my concerns with colleagues. It looked reasonable on the page. It also looked like justification. By Friday, I had convinced myself that the next move wasn't action, but preparation. If this ever came up, if someone asked questions, if something surfaced, I needed to be ready. Not defensive, ready. I began drafting a formal internal report, not to submit, just to see what it would look like if I did. The language shifted as I wrote, subtle at first. Potential concern became pattern of involvement. Requires further review became raises questions about propriety. Words mattered. I knew that better than most. And I was choosing them carefully. That realization unsettled me more than the content itself. Late Friday afternoon, my supervisor sent a calendar invite for the following week. Project oversight review, routine, scheduled months in advance. I'd been through dozens of them. Still, my pulse quickened when I saw it. That evening, I received another message. "You're not gathering facts anymore. You're rehearsing testimony." I slammed my phone down on the kitchen table, the sound sharp in the quiet house. "Enough," I said aloud, to no one. I didn't respond. I didn't delete it either. Saturday morning, I woke early and went for a walk along the lake. The air was cold and clean, the kind that burned your lungs just enough to remind you you were alive. I needed distance from screens, from documents, from the tightening loop of my own thoughts. As I walked, I replayed the past few weeks with a different lens, not as an investigator, as a brother. Lucas hadn't asked me for money. He hadn't tried to hide his involvement with the cooperative. Not really. He'd gone to public buildings, spoken openly, left a trail that anyone could follow if they cared to look. And yet, I'd never asked him why. I'd chosen observation over conversation because observation kept me in control. That was a hard truth to swallow. When I got home, there was an envelope on my porch, plain white, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no explanation, just a printed screenshot of one of my emails, the same one I'd found in my sent folder, highlighted in yellow. Beneath it, in neat black text, was a question. "Would you have written this differently if you knew someone was watching?" My hands shook slightly as I folded the paper and slid it back into the envelope. They weren't threatening me. They weren't exposing me. They were doing something worse. They were forcing me to see myself from the outside. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the memo open on my laptop and the envelope beside it. Two versions of my life, side by side. One built on rules and confidence. The other on doubt and rationalization. I scrolled to the section with my name under potential conflicts of interest. After a long moment, I added a line beneath it. Risk of compromised judgment due to personal involvement. I stared at the words, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. For the first time since this began, I wasn't preparing to accuse anyone. I was preparing to be questioned, and I didn't know which outcome scared me more. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on Tuesday. I arrived at the county building earlier than usual, and sat in my car with the engine off, hands resting on my knees. The garage was quiet at that hour, the concrete still holding the night's cold. I stared at the steering wheel and tried to slow my breathing, the way I had before difficult presentations in the past. This wasn't a presentation. This was a mirror. I walked up the stairs instead of taking the elevator, feeling each step in my legs. The hallway lights hummed softly. When I reached my office, I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I sat at my desk in the half-dark and opened the memo one last time. I read it from beginning to end without editing a single word. It sounded reasonable, thoughtful, responsible. It also sounded like it had already decided who the problem was. At 9 sharp, I walked into the conference room. My supervisor sat at the head of the table, a folder open in front of him. 2 other managers were there, both people I'd worked with for years. Familiar faces, neutral expressions. "Morning," my supervisor said. "Have a seat." I did. The review started the way these things always did. Timelines, budget summaries, minor delays. I answered questions easily, automatically, my voice steady. For a moment, I almost relaxed. This was my terrain. This was what I knew. Then my supervisor leaned back slightly and folded his hands. "There's been some concern raised," he said, carefully. "Nothing formal, just something we want to be proactive about." My pulse picked up. He slid a document across the table toward me. It wasn't my memo. It was an excerpt, not printed from my computer, but rewritten, paraphrased, sanitized. My language, stripped of context, and presented as observation rather than intent. I recognized my own thinking immediately. The way you recognize your voice on a recording and hate how it sounds. One of the managers cleared her throat. "This mentions a potential conflict involving a family member." "Yes," I said. "My brother." "How did that come to your attention?" she asked. I answered honestly, too honestly. I noticed his name in some project-related payments. I began reviewing publicly available information to understand the context. My supervisor nodded slowly. "And at what point did you consider disclosing that potential conflict?" The room felt smaller. "I was in the process of organizing my thoughts," I said. "I didn't want to raise an issue without understanding it fully." That was true. It also wasn't the whole truth. The manager across from me leaned forward. "Were you aware that conducting parallel analysis outside of formal channels can create the appearance of bias?" I swallowed. "Yes." "Did that concern you?" "Yes." "Is for that." "And yet you continued." I nodded. No one raised their voice. No one accused me of wrongdoing. The questions came one at a time, precise and calm, the way professionals dissected problems without needing to dramatize them. By the time the meeting ended, nothing had been decided, no actions taken, no reprimands issued, but something had shifted. As I stood to leave, my supervisor said quietly, "We'll need to revisit some assignments, just to maintain clarity." End quote. I understood what he was saying. Trust, once questioned, didn't snap back into place. Back in my office, I closed the door and sat at my desk, staring at the blank wall opposite me. I felt drained, not from confrontation, but from the realization that I'd been speaking a language I hadn't known I was learning. At noon, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. "You heard it, didn't you?" I didn't respond. Instead, I stood up, grabbed my coat, and left the building. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Lucas was at the cooperative. I knew that now. Not from following him, but from the meeting notes I'd seen referenced, the ones that hadn't come from me. He was listed as a community liaison, volunteer, unpaid. I drove there without thinking too hard about it, the way you sometimes turn down a familiar street without remembering when you decided to. The building looked the same as always, quiet, unassuming. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. A few people sat around a table, papers spread out in front of them. They looked up as I entered, curiosity flickering across their faces. Lucas was at the far end, talking to a woman I didn't recognize. When he saw me, he stopped mid-sentence. The room went quiet. "This is my brother," he said, after a moment. "Ethan." No introductions followed. No explanations. Just a pause, heavy with awareness. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. "I just need to hear something." Lucas nodded. He gestured toward an empty chair. "Sit." I did. The woman at the table glanced between us, then stood. "We'll give you a minute," she said, gathering her things. One by one, the others followed, leaving us alone in the room. Lucas leaned back, crossing his arms. He looked tired. "You've been watching me," he said, not accusing, stating. "Yes," I said. He exhaled slowly. "I figured you could have told me," I said. "About this, about what you're doing." "You could have asked," he replied. The words landed harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it. He was right. That option had always been there. "You know why I didn't," I said finally. "Because you didn't trust me," he said. "Or because trusting me meant questioning yourself?" I didn't answer. He leaned forward. "Do you know what we do here?" "I have an idea," I said. "We help people understand systems that were designed without them in mind," he said. "We document patterns. We ask questions no one wants to ask, because asking them makes you unpopular." I felt a chill. "Sounds familiar," I said. Lucas smiled, just slightly. "Yeah, that's why they needed someone like you." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He studied me for a moment, then spoke carefully. "This wasn't about catching you doing something illegal. You know that, right?" I nodded slowly. "It was about watching how you react when the rules don't give you a clear answer," he continued. "When the problem isn't a bad guy, but a gray area." I thought of the emails, the messages, the timing. "You were being tested," I said. "So were you," he replied. I sat back, the weight of it pressing in from all sides. "Why me?" I asked. Lucas shrugged. "Because you believe in the system. Because you think following the rules makes you objective." "And it doesn't?" I asked. "It makes you human," he said, "which means you still have blind spots." We sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, I spoke. "You let me go too far." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He met my eyes. "Because if I'd stopped you, you would have called it interference. Now you have to call it experience." I left the cooperative without another word. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the meeting at work, Lucas's words echoing in my head. I heard my own voice answering questions, measured and precise, and realized something that made my chest tighten. I hadn't been defending the truth. I'd been defending the version of myself that needed to be right. And someone had let me hear it out loud. I didn't know yet what that would cost me, but I knew it wasn't over. I didn't go back to work that afternoon. I drove home, parked in my driveway, and sat in the car with my hands on the wheel long after the engine had gone quiet. The house looked the same as it always had, brick steady, porch light off in the daylight, but it no longer felt like a place I could retreat into. It felt like a place where I would have to answer questions I'd been avoiding. Lucas's words replayed in my head, not loudly, but persistently. "You were being tested." I had spent weeks convinced I was the observer, the evaluator, the one with enough distance to remain clean. Realizing I had been the subject all along made my stomach twist in a way suspicion never had. That night, I opened the memo one more time, not to add to it, to read it the way someone else would. Stripped of my justifications, it was obvious what it really was, a record of escalation. Each section moved me farther away from the person I believed I was, and closer to someone who believed intention mattered less than outcome, as long as the outcome favored my sense of order. I scrolled to the bottom and closed the document without saving any changes. The next morning, my supervisor called. "Take the day," he said. "No drama. Just take it." I thanked him and hung up, the words "no drama" echoing uncomfortably. There was no drama because no one thought I'd done anything illegal. Yet, what I'd done was worse, in a quieter way. I spent the day walking. No destination, no headphones, Just blocks of Milwaukee streets I'd passed 100 times without really seeing. I noticed small things, the way a bus driver waited for an older man to sit before pulling away, the way a handwritten "for rent" sign had been taped over a cracked window twice, like someone had tried to make it stick and failed. By mid-afternoon, I found myself outside the cooperative again. I didn't go in. I sat on a low concrete wall across the street and watched people come and go. This time, I wasn't cataloging their movements. I was watching my own reactions to them, who I assumed things about, who I gave the benefit of the doubt to without realizing it. It was uncomfortable work. My phone buzzed while I sat there. Unknown number. This time, the message was longer. You weren't selected because you were corrupt. You were selected because you were predictable. I read it twice. Predictable. I'd always thought of myself as principled, not predictable. The difference mattered more now than it ever had. I typed a response before I could talk myself out of it. Who are you? The reply came almost immediately. Someone who's had to sit across from men like you in conference rooms for 20 years. That told me enough. What do you want from me? I typed. There was a pause this time, long enough that I thought they wouldn't respond at all. Then, nothing. You already gave it. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my pulse steady but heavy. They weren't asking for cooperation. They weren't threatening exposure. They weren't recruiting me. They were closing the loop. That evening, Lucas came over. He didn't knock. He used the spare key I'd given him years ago, back when trust was something I didn't analyze. I heard the door open and close, his footsteps moving through the house. I stayed at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea I hadn't tasted yet. He sat across from me without saying anything. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. I'm not mad, he said finally. I am, I replied, just not at you. He nodded. That tracks. I didn't realize how fast I'd go there, I said. Once I thought I was protecting something. Lucas leaned back in the chair. Most people don't. That's why it works. Works for who? I asked. For systems that need good people to enforce bad habits, he said. For organizations that rely on the idea that intent erases impact. I winced. You think that's what I do? I think that's what you've been trained to do, he corrected. There's a difference. We sat with that. You could have told me, I said again, softer this time. You wouldn't have heard it, he replied. Not then. I knew he was right. Hearing it now was hard enough. Was any of it real? I asked. The payments? The oversight? Yes, he said. All of it. The work matters. The scrutiny matters. The gray areas are real. And me? He met my eyes. You were the variable. The word landed like a weight. I crossed lines, I said. I know that now. You didn't break laws, Lucas said. You broke trust with yourself. That's harder to document, but it sticks longer. He stood to leave, pausing by the door. What happens now? I asked. That depends on you, he said. The test part is over. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet house and thought about that. The test was over. At work, things changed subtly. My name was moved off the road project, not as punishment, as precaution. A different assignment took its place, smaller in scope, more procedural. No one said why. They didn't have to. I felt the shift in the way conversations paused when I entered rooms. The way colleagues measured their words around me now, not because they feared me, but because they weren't sure where I stood. It was the cost of being seen. A week later, I received an email from HR requesting a meeting. Routine, exit interview-adjacent, but not quite. They wanted feedback, perspective. I almost laughed at the irony. In the meeting, I chose my words carefully, not to protect myself, to be accurate. I thought following the rules made me neutral, I said. I didn't realize how often it just made me comfortable. The woman across from me nodded, writing something down. She didn't argue. She didn't reassure me. She thanked me. That night, at home, I deleted the memo, all of it, every draft, every note, every rationalization. Not because it was wrong to document, but because I documented from the wrong place. I sat back in my chair, the house quiet around me, and felt something settle. Not relief, not redemption. Clarity. I hadn't uncovered corruption. I'd uncovered something more unsettling. How easily I became someone I'd warned others about the moment I believed my intentions were enough to excuse my actions. The rules hadn't failed me. I had misunderstood what they were for. And now, there was no unseeing that. The strangest part was how ordinary everything looked afterward. No headlines, no formal warnings pinned to bulletin boards, no whispered scandals echoing through the hallways. If you didn't know what to look for, you would have thought nothing had changed at all. But I felt it everywhere. My reassignment became official the following Monday. A brief email, carefully worded, thanking me for my flexibility and continued professionalism. I was moved from oversight to documentation support, still important work, still necessary, but far from the center of decision-making. It wasn't a demotion, not on paper, but it was a narrowing. My new office was smaller, windowless, tucked near a records room that smelled faintly of toner and old carpet. I told myself it was temporary. Rotations happened. Careers had seasons. This was just a shift in focus. The problem was, no one said it was temporary. Colleagues still greeted me politely, but conversations ended sooner now. Invitations to informal meetings dried up. People who used to stop by my desk with questions sent emails instead, copying supervisors I hadn't interacted with much before. Trust doesn't disappear in a dramatic way. It erodes quietly, like water seeping into concrete until something gives. I became acutely aware of my own behavior in ways that bordered on self-surveillance. I reread emails before sending them, deleting phrases that might sound too confident, too suggestive. I stuck rigidly to templates and approved language, even when flexibility would have saved time. I was following the rules more closely than ever, and for the first time, it felt like fear. At home, the silence stretched differently now. Lucas didn't come over on Tuesdays anymore. Not because we'd fought, not because we'd agreed to stop. It just stopped happening. We texted occasionally. Neutral check-ins, short updates, no tension, but no ease either. Something had shifted between us, and neither of us was pretending otherwise. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing a single plate, I realized how much of my identity had been wrapped around being the reliable one, the brother who had his life together, the guy people leaned on. Without that role, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. The thought unsettled me more than losing status ever had. A week later, I received a request from internal review. Not an investigation, a consultation. They wanted my input on a new training module focused on ethical decision-making and conflict awareness. Someone, somewhere, had decided my recent experience made me a useful voice, just not in the way I'd expected. The irony was sharp enough to sting. In the meeting, a young analyst asked me a question that caught me off guard. How do you know when you've crossed from responsibility into control? I opened my mouth to answer with something clean and rehearsed. Then I stopped. I don't think you know in the moment, I said slowly. I think you know afterward, when the damage is already done. They nodded, writing it down. No one argued. That night, I went home and found myself staring at the envelope that still sat in the back of a kitchen drawer. The one with the highlighted email and the printed question. Would you have written this differently if you knew someone was watching? I hadn't thrown it away. Part of me wanted to. Part of me knew why I hadn't. It was proof of something I couldn't afford to forget. A few days later, Lucas called. Not texted. Called. I answered on the second ring. Hey, he said. Hey, I replied. There was a pause. The sound of traffic on his end, faint and distant. I wanted to check in, he said. See how you're doing. I considered lying. The old reflex flared briefly. I'm adjusting, I said instead. Yeah, he said. That makes sense. We didn't talk about the cooperative, or the messages, or the test. We talked about mundane things, the weather, a grocery store closing near his apartment, a movie he'd watched and hated. But underneath it all was an unspoken awareness that something fundamental had changed between us. I know you didn't enjoy any of this, he said eventually. That's one way to put it, I replied. He hesitated. I need you to hear this, though. None of what happened was about humiliating you. I know, I said, and I did. Now, it was about limits, he continued. about showing how easy it is for good people to become dangerous when they stop questioning themselves. I closed my eyes briefly. I didn't feel dangerous, I said. That's the point, he replied. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room for a long time, letting that settle. Dangerous didn't always look like malice. Sometimes it looked like certainty. At work, the oversight review wrapped up without incident. No findings, no escalations. Officially, everything was fine. Unofficially, my career path had bent in a direction I hadn't anticipated. I was invited to fewer strategy sessions, but more ethics panels. Less influence, more reflection. It wasn't punishment. It was recalibration. I wasn't sure yet whether to resent it or accept it. One afternoon, as I was leaving the building, I passed the security desk and caught my reflection in the glass. Same face, same posture. But something in my expression had softened, or maybe hardened. It was hard to tell. I realized then that the real consequence hadn't been reassignment or reputation or discomfort. It had been the loss of moral simplicity. I could no longer tell myself a clean story about who I was. I couldn't divide the world neatly into rule followers and rule breakers, good actors and bad ones. Everything was messier now, more human. That awareness didn't come with relief. It came with responsibility. A responsibility I couldn't delegate or document away. Late that night, I received one final message from the unknown number. No preamble, no commentary, just 6 words. Now you have to choose differently. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. For the first time since this began, there was no next step laid out in front of me. No process to follow, no framework to lean on. Just the quiet understanding that whatever I did next would come from a place I'd never had to access before. Not authority, not certainty, but humility. And I knew, with a clarity that left no room for comfort, that there was no going back to the man I'd been before all this started. That version of me had believed being right was enough. He was gone. What remained was someone who finally understood the cost of believing that. If you'd asked me months earlier what accountability looked like, I would have described consequences with edges. Formal notices, clear reprimands, a line drawn, a verdict delivered, a lesson enforced. What I got instead was something far quieter. The HR meeting came and went without fireworks. The woman across the table thanked me for my honesty, asked a few clarifying questions, and closed her folder with a practiced calm that suggested this wasn't her first conversation of this kind. "There's no finding here," she said. "No violation." I nodded, feeling an odd mix of relief and disappointment. "But," she continued, "there are implications." That word lingered in the air between us. Implications didn't require signatures. They didn't come with appeal processes. They simply existed. They reshaped how people positioned you in a room, how much weight your opinions carried, how often your judgment was deferred to without question. I left the meeting knowing I hadn't been punished. I had been reclassified. In the weeks that followed, my calendar thinned out. I was still copied on updates, still invited to required meetings. But the spontaneous check-ins stopped. Decisions were made elsewhere and presented to me after the fact. My role shifted from shaping outcomes to ensuring records were complete and compliant. I told myself it was fine. Important work still mattered. But importance wasn't the same as influence, and I missed the latter more than I expected. The strangest part was how little resentment I felt. That absence worried me. I'd always believed anger was the natural response to being sidelined. Instead, what I felt was something closer to recognition, like seeing a version of yourself in an old photograph and realizing you no longer fit inside it. One afternoon, my supervisor stopped by my office. Not with an agenda, not with a concern, just a pause. "You holding up?" he asked. "Yes," I said. And this time, it was true. He hesitated. For what it's worth, this wasn't about trust being lost. It was about clarity. "Clarity about what?" I asked. "About where judgment needs guardrails," he said. "For all of us." He didn't say, "including you." He didn't have to. After he left, I sat back and stared at the ceiling tiles, thinking about how easily I'd equated trust with authority. How much of my confidence had been borrowed from the system itself, rather than earned through reflection. At home, My routine softened. I stopped tracking time so precisely. I let emails sit unanswered overnight. I cooked more slowly, without multitasking. Small changes that didn't announce themselves as growth but felt like it. Lucas came by one evening without warning. Not for dinner, just to drop something off. He handed me a paperback book, worn at the edges. The cover was creased, the pages dog-eared. "You left this at the cooperative," he said. I didn't remember bringing a book there. Then I opened it and saw my name written inside the cover, in my own handwriting, from years ago. A book I'd loaned to someone and forgotten. "Did you read it?" I asked. He shook his head. "Didn't need to." We stood on the porch for a moment, the late afternoon light slanting across the steps. "You okay?" he asked again. "I'm learning to be," I said. He smiled. "Good." He didn't stay. He didn't need to. Later that night, I flipped through the book and found a sentence I'd underlined long ago, one I had no memory of marking. Certainty is comfortable because it excuses us from listening. I closed the book and sat with that longer than necessary. At work, I was asked to mentor a new hire, fresh out of grad school, smart, eager, full of questions that assumed there were clean answers. In our first meeting, he asked me how to make sure he always did the right thing. I considered the question carefully. "I don't think that's the right goal," I said. He frowned. "What should the goal be?" "To notice when you're tempted to stop asking questions," I replied. "That's usually when things start going wrong." He wrote it down. Watching him reminded me of myself years earlier. Certain, well-intentioned, unaware of how thin the line was between confidence and control. I didn't feel superior to him. I felt responsible. One evening, I received a message from the unknown number. I hadn't heard from them in weeks. "You're still here. That matters." I stared at the screen, unsure how to interpret it. "Why?" I typed. The response came slower this time. "Because most people mistake surviving a test for passing it." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. That weekend, I cleaned out my desk drawer at work. Not because I was leaving, but because it felt necessary. I threw away old notes, outdated manuals, printouts I'd kept just in case. Among them was the small notebook I'd used to jot down behavioral indicators. I hesitated before tossing it. Then I dropped it into the bin. Letting go of the record felt like letting go of the need to be right. The following Monday, I walked into the building and nodded at the security guard like I always had. He nodded back. Nothing dramatic, nothing changed. And yet, everything had. I understood now that I hadn't escaped consequences. I'd been spared spectacle. The cost I paid wasn't public shame or formal discipline. It was the permanent loss of a simpler self-image. I could no longer tell myself that following the rules was enough, that neutrality was possible without reflection, that good intentions insulated you from harm. That knowledge sat with me every day, shaping how I spoke, how I listened, how quickly I moved to judgment. It wasn't punishment, it was weight. And unlike punishment, it didn't end when someone else decided it was over. I carried it forward, knowing there was no mechanism to hand it back. The system hadn't broken me, it had revealed me, and I was still here, learning how to live with what I'd seen. I thought the hardest part would be losing authority. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing how much of my identity had been built around the assumption that authority was deserved simply because I followed the rules. Once that belief cracked, everything I'd used to measure myself against others stopped working. There was no dramatic moment when this realization landed. No argument, no confrontation, just a slow accumulation of small, uncomfortable truths that refused to be ignored. It started with a conversation I overheard by accident. I was in the break room one morning, refilling my mug, when two coworkers came in behind me. They didn't know I was there, tucked around the corner by the sink. "I heard he used to run point on that road project," one of them said. "Yeah," the other replied. "He's smart, just intense." "Intense how?" A pause, like he always knows what the right answer is. Or thinks he does. I waited for them to say more, but they didn't. They left, voices fading down the hall. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the coffee as it sloshed slightly in the cup. They hadn't called me unethical, or dangerous, or wrong. They'd called me certain. That word followed me for the rest of the day. At home that evening, I pulled the old photo album off the shelf in the living room. Not for nostalgia, for evidence. I flipped through pictures of birthdays, holidays, family gatherings frozen in time. There I was at 25, standing stiffly in a suit at my first real job. At 32, holding a set of house keys like they were proof of something. At 40, smiling beside Lucas at our mother's funeral, my arm around his shoulders in a gesture that now felt more symbolic than supportive. I noticed how often I stood slightly forward in photos, how often my posture suggested leadership, direction, certainty. I wondered when that had become a shield instead of a strength. The next call from Lucas came on a Sunday afternoon. No agenda, no crisis. "I'm thinking about moving," he said. "Where?" I asked. "Not far. Just somewhere that isn't defined by this," he replied. "This being?" I asked. He paused. "Being the guy you're compared to so you can feel solid." The words stung, even though they weren't said unkindly. "I didn't mean to do that," I said. "I know," he replied. "That's kind of the problem." And we sat in that truth for a moment, neither of us rushing to fill the silence. "I never wanted to take anything from you," he added. "Not your job, not your reputation, not your sense of yourself." "I know," I said again. "And yet," he said quietly, "you still felt like I was." He wasn't accusing me. He was naming something I'd avoided. After we hung up, I realized that the twist in all of this, the part that refused to resolve cleanly, wasn't that I'd been tested. It was that I'd agreed to the test without realizing it. Not by responding to emails, not by following Lucas, but by living my life as if being right exempted me from being questioned. No one had forced that mindset on me. I'd chosen it. That understanding shifted the moral weight of everything that had happened. There was no villain here. No hidden mastermind pulling strings for personal gain. No betrayal in the traditional sense. The harm came from something quieter. From a belief system that rewarded confidence more than curiosity. From my willingness to accept that reward without interrogating it. A few weeks later, I was asked to sit on a panel for new supervisors. Not to lead it, to contribute. The topic was decision-making under uncertainty. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't prepare slides. I didn't bring notes. I told them a story instead. Not about Lucas. Not about the cooperative. Not about the emails. I told them about a moment when I noticed something that didn't fit and decided observation was safer than conversation. About how that choice felt responsible in the moment and corrosive in hindsight. I watched their faces as I spoke. Some nodded. Some looked uncomfortable. A few leaned back, arms crossed, unconvinced. That was fine. I wasn't there to persuade them. I was there to mark the edge of a cliff I hadn't known existed. Afterward, one of the attendees approached me, younger than me by at least a decade, confident in the way I'd once been. "So what would you do differently?" he asked. I thought about that carefully. "I'd slow down," I said, "and I'd ask myself, who benefits most from my certainty?" He frowned slightly. "Isn't certainty part of leadership?" "Only if you confuse leadership with control," I replied. He didn't answer right away, just nodded and walked off. I didn't need to know what he took from it. That night, I sat alone on my porch, the air cool, the street quiet. A neighbor's porch light flicked on across the way. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and went quiet. I thought about the question Lucas had asked me weeks earlier. If I was guilty, would you still have followed the rules? At the time, I'd heard it as a challenge. Now, I heard it as something else. A mirror. The twist wasn't that I'd been wrong about him. It was that I'd been wrong about myself. I'd believed my morality was static, something earned once and maintained by habit. I'd never considered that it required the same scrutiny I applied to systems and budgets and other people. No one had betrayed me. I'd simply reached the limit of a story about myself that no longer held. And standing there in the quiet, I understood something that felt both sobering and strangely freeing. Justice hadn't been served. There had been no victory. What I'd gained instead was responsibility without applause, a chance to choose differently, not because someone was watching, but because I finally understood the cost of not doing so. That was the real twist. Not exposure, not punishment, but the realization that the person I'd trusted most to be right had always been the one most in need of questioning. And that person was me. Nothing dramatic marked the end of it. No closing email. No final message from the unknown number. No conversation that wrapped everything up neatly and told me what it had all meant. The story didn't end because life rarely waits for clarity before moving on. It just continued. Spring arrived slowly in Milwaukee, the way it always does. Like the city wasn't sure it trusted the warmth yet. Snow melted into gray slush along the curbs. The lake stayed cold and indifferent. People walked a little faster, shoulders loosening inch by inch. I noticed those things now. Before, I would have been thinking about deadlines, or processes, or whether the world was functioning the way it was supposed to. Now, I found myself paying attention to how people moved through it instead. At work, I settled into my new role without resistance. Not because I was content, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Status was a tool, not a verdict. Losing proximity to power didn't erase my ability to act ethically. If anything, it stripped away the illusion that ethics were automatic when authority was present. I stopped trying to regain what I'd lost. Instead, I focused on doing the work in front of me cleanly, quietly, with fewer assumptions about my own importance. When colleagues came to me with questions, I answered them. When they didn't, I didn't insert myself. That restraint was harder than ambition had ever been, but it felt honest. Lucas moved a month later. Not far. A smaller place closer to the river, with creaky floors and uneven windows. I helped him carry boxes up a narrow stairwell, both of us sweating and out of breath by the time we were done. We didn't talk about the past while we worked. We didn't need to. At one point, he handed me a box labeled Books, Misc, and laughed. "You always hated that label," he said. "I still do," I replied. "Some habits don't need to be unlearned." Afterward, we sat on his bare living room floor, backs against the wall, sharing a takeout pizza balanced between us. The room smelled like cardboard and dust and tomato sauce. "You good?" he asked. "I think so," I said. "You?" he shrugged. "Figuring things out." The phrase used to irritate me. Now it just sounded human. We fell into an easier rhythm after that. Not the old one. Something quieter, more careful. Conversations without roles attached to them. No fixing, no comparing. Just two people acknowledging each other without needing to define who was ahead. One evening, months later, I realized I hadn't checked my sent folder in weeks. The thought startled me. I opened my email, half expecting to feel that old pull toward self-audit, toward scanning for signs I'd missed something important. The impulse flickered, then faded. I closed the laptop without opening anything else. That was how I knew something fundamental had changed. The unknown number never contacted me again. I didn't miss it. Whatever that test had been, formal or informal, intentional or emergent, it had served its purpose, not by exposing me, but by exhausting the version of me that needed certainty to feel safe. I didn't need reminders anymore. One afternoon, while walking along the lake, I passed a group of interns on a tour of the county building grounds. Their supervisor gestured toward the skyline, explaining how decisions made inside those walls affected the city. I listened as I walked by, hearing echoes of things I'd once believed without question. A young woman in the group raised her hand. "How do you make sure power doesn't get misused?" she asked. The supervisor hesitated, smiled, gave a careful answer about policies and oversight and checks and balances. All true. Incomplete. I kept walking. At home that night, I pulled the envelope out of the drawer for the last time. The paper inside was creased now. The yellow highlight faded slightly. Would you have written this differently if you knew someone was watching? I didn't need to answer it anymore. I tore the paper in half, then in quarters, then into pieces small enough that the words disappeared. I dropped them into the trash and didn't look back. Not because I was done learning, but because I was done needing proof. The final shift came quietly, without announcement. I stopped thinking of ethics as something you have and started understanding it as something you practice. Something that requires attention, humility, and the willingness to be uncomfortable without demanding resolution. Some days, I failed at that. Other days, I caught myself before I did. Both mattered. The life I returned to wasn't improved in any visible way. I didn't gain influence back. I didn't earn a redemption arc. I didn't become wiser in a way that impressed anyone else. But I became steadier, less reactive, less certain, more aware of how quickly good intentions can turn sharp when they're left unquestioned. I used to believe being right was the goal. Now, I understood that being willing to be wrong and to adjust without needing to be punished first was far rarer and far more necessary. Nothing in my life apologized for what it had put me through. The city didn't. The system didn't. The story didn't. And that was fine, because for the first time, I wasn't waiting for vindication. I wasn't waiting to be proven correct. I was simply living with the understanding that integrity isn't something you declare. It's something you keep choosing, quietly, long after no one is watching. And that choice, unseen, uncelebrated, and ongoing, was the only ending this story ever needed.